Hey everybody, how's it going? This is going to be our second video in this respiratory. Yeah, it's been a long day. I'm not even going to sit here and lie. In our reproduction lecture, I got two things to say. So number one, I apologize if this screen is showing kind of grainy. Not sure what happened to my laptop today. I think my laptop is beginning to show its age, and so it's starting to have a really fuzzy picture. And then number two, I'm sitting in a room with my border collie spaniel mix, and so I just got home from work, so he's kind of demanding attention. So if you see a random toy or something big, black, and fuzzy show up in the screen, it's not a monster, it's just him. And I'm kind of petting him on his head right now with my hands. So as you know, I'm kind of animated with both hands, and I got one over here just kind of keeping him company. And so if there's a random toy comes flying across the screen, just ignore that. That's just him. It's Tierno, and he just turned 3. So maybe I'll send you guys a picture of him this weekend with his well, I'll send you a picture of him this weekend, and you can see how spoiled he is. Anyway, in the first video, I was talking to you guys about the male reproductive system. This one, I want to get into the female reproductive system, and I really want to mirror a lot of what I was talking about with the male. Um, and I want to start off, of course, with the gametes. And okay, he just like leaned against the laptop here and decided to get all comfortable. So anyway, so I want to start with the gametes. Now, please understand that for women, you start making gametes before you're born. So somewhere between month 4 and 6, the female fetus begins to create gametes. And gametogenesis takes place. Specifically for females, it will be oogenesis. So you start producing oocytes. You start off with oogonium, the stem cells. They undergo mitosis, and then they undergo meiosis 1. Well, they start meiosis 1, and then they stop, and they literally freeze at prophase 1, and that's at about month 6 of the fetal development. And those egg cells, those gametes, do not mature at all until you get until you get to puberty. Once they get to puberty, then those oocytes come out of that pause state, and they continue meiosis 1, and then they freeze at meiosis 2, and they don't complete meiosis 2 and become an ovum until they encounter sperm cells. And once the sperm cells encounter the egg cell, then the egg cell becomes a mature egg. It goes from an oocyte to an ovum, and then of course it turns into a zygote, and then 9 months later you got little person. Another thing that's important to note is that with spermatogenesis, you saw you started off with spermatogonium, the stem cells, and then the stem cells underwent mitosis. And remember, when a father cell undergoes mitosis, you wind up with 2 daughter cells, and one daughter cell is going to decide to be like their father cell and remain a stem cell, while the second daughter cell is going to become a specialized cell and is going to become something else. Well, the same thing happens in spermatogenesis. The spermatogonium becomes 2 daughter cells, and one becomes a primary spermatocyte, and the other one stays a spermatogonium. With oocytes, it's not that simple. Spermatogenesis, real easy. It's somewhere between 5 and 7 weeks spermatogenesis takes place. You go from spermatogonium to primary spermatocyte. The primary spermatocyte then finishes meiosis 1, becomes a secondary spermatocyte. Then it finishes meiosis 2, becomes a spermatid, then undergoes spermiogenesis, and then it goes from secondary spermatocyte And then it goes from spermatid to spermatozoa or sperm cell. Boom, you're done. Oocytes, not so simple. Oocytes, they undergo oogonium, they undergo mitosis, then you get a primary oocyte and a polar body. And you're kind of looking at it like, dude, why do we have a polar body and a cell? In other words, why do we have a piece of a cell that's going to be used as nothing and an actual cell over there? What's going on? I'm missing something. So it does not make an even division. It's not an even split. Not like in spermatogenesis, where we all know that mitosis is supposed to create an even split. But in this case, you don't get that. You get an unevenness that takes place. Same thing from when you go from primary oocyte to a secondary oocyte. Uneven. So at the end of this whole thing, you only get one haploid, while with the male spermatogenesis, or with the male gametes, you get four haploid cells. And remember, they call them haploid because they have half the genetic material. They got 23 chromosomes instead of 46. And it takes 46 to make a person. So with oogenesis, it starts when she's a fetus, but it pauses before she's ever born. It pauses like at the end of the second trimester, and it doesn't pick back up until you get to puberty. And when you get to puberty, then the ovarian cycle kicks in, follicular maturation happens, and ultimately ovulation and possible fertilization. Speaking along those lines, you also have to remember that the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle are happening at the same time. So I remember when I first had to learn this stuff, I had a lot of trouble trying to understand it, conceptualize what was going on. I literally had to draw everything out for myself. I'll be honest with you. I'll tell you something I don't think I've ever told any other class. I actually took an old calendar and wrote out the ovarian cycle and then wrote out the uterine cycle in that old calendar to understand and conceptualize what was actually happening. When I was in high school, um, there was a long period of time where I was the only guy in the house, and there were like 6 females in the house. So I kind of got to learn about the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle, um, whether I wanted to or not. And then when I got to college, I learned about the reproductive physiology, and I wrote all this stuff out in calendars, and I was able to understand it better. And you might need to do the exact same thing. So think of it this way: this is an average, okay? Disclaimer: average. I know some women who their ovarian cycle is literally 14 days, and then I've met some women who their ovarian cycle is 35. So people can have a wide range of ovarian cycles. What I'm talking about, is an average. So 28 days being the average, on day one of the ovarian cycle, you have selected your primary follicle to walk through the process from growth to ovulation. Meanwhile, on day one in the uterus, you're experiencing day one of menses, aka the period. So um, around somewhere between day one and day seven, you go from a primary follicle, it then matures into a secondary follicle, and you've got this secondary oocyte in there. By that time in the uterus, you stop the period, and now you've gone to the phases of actually growing out the endometrium. So essentially, what happened was in the uterus, you were removing the endometrial wall, at least the outer layer of the endometrial wall, while the ovaries at that same time are doing nothing but focusing on maturing and preparing the follicle, which in turn is maturing and preparing the egg cell on the inside. Then, by the time you get to day 14 in the ovary, you then ovulate. And basically, what's happened is that Graafian follicle or tertiary follicle swollen to the place where it pops, it bursts, and the egg cell erupts from this follicle. Meanwhile, the uterus is putting its finishing touches on that new uterine lining, that new endometrial lining that has just been laid down. Then the ovary says, you know what, we might be getting pregnant, so I'm going to transform this Graafian follicle from a busted corpus hemorrhagicum into a corpus luteum. And that corpus luteum, the word luteum meaning yellow body or yellowish, corpus meaning body, so it's the yellow body. The corpus luteum then begins to produce progesterone in hopes of pregnancy occurring, and it releasing progesterone to prepare the body for possible pregnancy. At this time, the uterus has now successfully built a brand new lining for implantation. If there is a baby, and in other words, if the sperm cells do arrive at the oocyte, fertilize the oocyte, and then form a zygote, it will then move its way back down the fallopian tube into the uterus and implant itself on the endometrial wall. Once that a successful implantation takes place, it will then signal the rest of the body, we're pregnant. No need to do that ovarian cycle thing. We'll see you in 9 months. Deuces. If there is no pregnancy, there is no fertilization, no signals will be sent to the ovaries, and so the corpus luteum will then die. It'll regress and die, and it will become the corpus albicans, with albicans means white, corpus means body. So it becomes the corpus albicans. With that being the case, there's a sharp drop in progesterone, and by that drop of progesterone, that resets everything. The sharp drop in progesterone is a signal to the uterus to tell it, we'll start this whole party all over again, and it goes on to remove the outer layer of the endometrial wall, which therefore starts a period. I think the other thing that is really key to understanding the female reproductive system are the hormones. And that's really very key. You got to understand that for women, you have multiple hormones functioning at any given time, day, during the month. So in the textbook, they show 2 hormones compared with one another, and then another 2 hormones compared with one another. In the textbook, they show FSH and LH, and they show the ebbs and flows of FSH and LH during the ovarian and uterine cycle. This is because FSH and LH are both gonadotropins, which are released from the anterior pituitary. So everything really actually starts with gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is released from the hypothalamus. That travels to the anterior pituitary, and then the anterior pituitary is then forced to release its gonadotropins. And then FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, targets the follicles and stimulates follicular growth, while luteinizing hormone doesn't seem very important up until around day 14, when we see what's called an LH surge, and that LH hormone does its job. So FSH, it stimulates follicular growth. If you stimulate follicular growth, then the follicles get bigger and they grow, which means that they take care of the egg cell or the oocyte on the inside, which allows the oocyte to mature along with the follicle. Meanwhile, as we approach day 14, luteinizing hormone experiences a LH surge, and luteinizing hormone causes the Graafian follicle to drastically increase the amount of fluid inside of the follicle, which once it fills up with enough fluid, it pops, which is what we refer to as an ovulation. After day 14, you don't need FSH and LH anymore. You've already ovulated, so you don't need LH. That was its whole purpose in life. And then FSH, you don't need to grow out your follicle anymore. Excuse me. So you don't need to grow out your follicle anymore because, well, we've ovulated. So there's no cell inside to take care of. Um, so there's no need for that. So FSH and both FSH and LH, their concentrations drop drastically. And we don't see them make a comeback until day 0, day 28, when progesterone levels make a drop, and then it causes the uterine wall to begin to slough off, and then we have selected our new primary follicle to go through this whole ovarian cycle and process with us again. Meanwhile, in the textbook, they compare two other hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Now, pay close attention to these two hormones because both of these hormones are created by the follicle. It's just the estrogen is the dominant hormone at one point in time, and progesterone is the dominant hormone at another. So when you're looking at the first 14 days of the ovarian cycle, you'll see that estrogen levels begin to increase. All right. Because estrogen, as the follicles grow, it's the cells in the follicle that are making estrogen. So as the follicles grow and you make more cells, naturally you're making more estrogen. I was about to say testosterone. You're making more estrogen. So the more the follicle grows, the more cells are being used, more cells the follicle has because it's growing and it's a mass of cells. So the more cells you have, the more estrogen they're producing, until finally the follicle pops. It ovulates and it pops open, and the egg cell comes out, and then you see a sharp decline in estrogen because, of course, the follicle just blew up. So no, it's not thinking about producing estrogen right now. It actually exploded. And so its hull or its walls are breached. And so a lot of these cells have just died. And so estrogen levels drop. But then as the follicle turns from a graphene follicle to a corpus hemorrhagicum to a corpus luteum, it seals up, it transforms into a corpus luteum, and now the dominant hormone that the follicle is creating is progesterone. And you'll see in the textbook, you'll see progesterone spike while estrogen is trying to make a comeback. And then, of course, if nothing signals from the uterus that there's a pregnancy, the corpus luteum will die. It turns into a corpus albicans, corpus meaning body, albicans meaning white. And at that point, progesterone nosedives and estrogen begins to taper off as well. And I think that's about it for right now for the female reproductive system. If you have any more questions, please send them in so I can do some possible videos for that. But if you got any other questions, please let me know. Oh, there was another question about something with fluid electrolyte balance. I'm going to try to get a video up for that too this weekend. Talk to you guys soon.